Today's Tactical Tuesday is going to look at some hypothetical matchups. After writing down several decks and interviewing players, local and worldwide, I narrowed my list down to the following 8 decks that I believe will have the most showing at least for Nationals of 2023. In some ways, you could perceive this video as a tier list, but for the most part I explain what's going on in the chart and why some decks have advantages over others. Keep in mind that these decks when matched with themselves will be one of them being the winner, so with that in mind it's a toss-up based on variables such as who's going first, mulligans, who draws better, and who has a more cracked security. But for now, let's focus on the first column here, the top 8 decks in my mind. Anubismon, Guran X, and Miragegaogamon are the frontrunners in my mind for being the big 3. For Anubismon, this deck has the most versatility, but in some ways it also has some weaknesses. Guran and Miragegaogamon have a lot of unsuspends that can make them hyper-aggressive, but in the face of Anubismon, it can be problematic. Security Control and Beelstar are the decks that in my mind, while not necessarily aggressive, have security bombs that can influence the tide of the game, whether your opponent decks out first, or they can't clear everything through. But for the last 3 decks, in my mind when it comes to power, speed, defense, and wildcard factors, because of the potential oversaturation of Anubismon, Red Hybrid, Hunters, and shinegreymon are also the ones that I feel will be in the top 8 represented decks. True, I made no mention of Yellow Hybrid, Royal Knights, Belvemon, Greymon Toolbox, Lugamon, and more. But when observing trends in how players are playtesting, Anubismon seems to be the major contender that will be represented, and as such, some decks will naturally have an easier time countering it. With that in mind, let's begin the breakdown of this chart looking at win-loss ratios. Anubismon versus Guran X is largely going to depend on 2 things. Number 1, how fast can Anubismon turbo, and personally number 2, which variant are you on? While I did tinker with my variant of the deck with Biting Crush, a majority of high-level competitive players, including Huang Zero, Frozen, and Dan Bang of Gaia Force Gaming, feel this card is a brick. But despite this, you also run Floodgates in purple that can deal with Guran X's ability to manipulate memory. Not to mention, due to Retaliator blockers, it skews more towards Anubismon. In this situation, Miragegaogamon is the same, and with a fully established board, it can be difficult to attack through. For Anubismon, the deck matchup against Security Control and Beelstar are more 45-55 for the fact that security bombs can't delete your stacks repeatedly. Sure, you may have another one potentially set up, but I've played games where I've cleared out all the Anubismon and waited for my opponent to get their Calling from Darkness, or they deck out. Needless to say, it's a minor nuisance, but it's a thin margin of loss. Against Red Hybrid, this is also another thin margin of loss, for the fact that option cards like Crimson Blaze are present, and they could be on Floodgates like Gotsumon. But undoubtedly, it's also the fact that Anubismon lacks security bombs, and Red Hybrid can capitalize on multiple checks in a single turn. Lastly, Hunter can do some damage in the case we saw at Kamsao's tournament. Needless to say, if you have Mervamon and Anubismon out, I'm curious which you tuck. However, there's also the situation where 2 Oromon might be making more appearances for the D-Digivolve mechanic. And shinegreymon does a lot of damage against a lot of other decks. However, DP reduction might not be enough in the face of Mervamon or the 2 backup Soulmons that DP buff you. Generally speaking, Anubismon has the worst matchup against security-heavy decks, or decks that might just run Crimson Blaze that could lock you out a turn. But even then, a rough estimate of 45% as your lowest threshold isn't terrible. Switching gears to Guran X, I feel Mirage has a slight advantage in terms of play. True, Guran has battle protection, but Mirage can bounce in many ways, negating this fact. Not to mention, there are security bombs for Mirage versus Melga. Likewise, this deck suffers severely from security bombs in Security Control and Beelstar, but in terms of speed, it capitalizes against everyone else. Hunters and Red Hybrid typically have more tamers and security, but Shine could be problematic due to DP reduction. Mirage likewise suffers similar problems as Melga in the Security Control and Beelstar matchup, but can mitigate it in some ways due to Mirage returning security to hand. This ever so slightly bumps up its win rate. In regards to Mirage against Red Hybrid and Hunters, you'll notice the matchup percentage goes down versus Melga. It's my belief that because of setting up tamers at times can slow your plays down. As a result, the win rate slightly goes down, but nonetheless, a win is a win. Security Control largely has good matchup against everything except 3 things. Number 1, Red Hybrid has good old Aldamon, who can negate option cards, meaning you're more dependent on deleting their Digimon the following turn if possible. And Guran X has faster chip damage that could result in a loss. But the third thing I mentioned, itself. Depending on your luck, you could have a mirror match round 1, and if your matchup goes to a draw, well, that's it, the run's already done. Shine has some advantages in that you could hit into security with Marcus instead. Only downside is if the option card removes your Shine stack, there goes that potential for burst Digivolution. With Red Hybrid, it's another razor-thin margin of loss between these 2 decks. In discussion with local players, some effects could tuck Digimon with deletion effects and Tamers, but simultaneously, Red Hybrid could out-aggro into a mostly free security with no bombs. At least, the ones not teching Crimson Blaze. Shine could also set up blockers in the case of Marcus and do some real damage with DP reduction. Again, this is a mild toss-up of 40-60 out of favor. And finally, Guran X of course is kind of free in that security bombs don't matter in the face of BT7 Aldamon. Hunters has a close to even matchup with shinegreymon, but for Guran X I felt that with the number of options that bounce, because the Digimon is not deleted, this can result in some interactions where you lose your sources and can't save anything. But generally speaking, none of this may happen. Who knows? We might see one deck completely dominate that was completely unexpected. While you can practice your combos and all of the various different matchups, you may match into the most obscure thing and not know what the overall goal of the deck is. What were your thoughts on today's Tactical Tuesday, and what deck do you think will win Nationals? Do you think it will be one of the decks I mentioned here? Or will it be a dark horse deck? Let me know in the comments as I take a break from What If this week, in preparation for a lot of info dump. This is DigiPanda, logging out.